Hello fellow professionals around the world, welcome to my channel. Cross-cultural communication has become such an integral part of our everyday lives, hasn't it? In this video, I will cover 3 basic aspects of cross-cultural communication that are useful to pay attention to no matter what cultures are involved. Once you become conscientious of these details, you will feel and act very comfortably in any cross-cultural situation. Let's get started. This is Adrienne here with Communications Plus, helping you communicate with clarity and confidence as you're shaping the world. If you're new here, be sure to hit the subscribe button below so you don't miss out on any practical tips. They are coming your way every Thursday. The 3 specific aspects of culture that I will cover in this video are perception of time, nonverbal communication, and level of directness. Before we dive into cultural differences, let's define what culture is. I define culture as a system of ideas and behaviors that are accepted and familiar to a particular group of people. I know there are other definitions out there, but for the purpose of this video, let's go with this one. I will use the idea of low context and high context cultures as a framework for covering these points. Generally speaking, Western Europe and those countries with heavy Western European influence, such as Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States, are low context cultures, and much of the rest of the world is classified as high context culture. Now let's look at how our first aspect of culture, perception of time, differs in high context as opposed to low context cultures. In a low context culture, time is perceived as a very exact, defined thing. For example, if you're invited to a meeting at 10 o'clock in Germany in a work environment, you'd better show up with your notebook or your laptop at 9:55 because the meeting is likely to start at 10:00. If you are late, which let's say 10:10 would be perceived late, then you better apologize because that is just considered impolite. Everyone else will be there at 10 o'clock. So it's a very exact, defined thing, and this affects every area of life, professional life especially. On the other hand, in a high context culture, Colombia, South America, for example, time is just a general approximation, just a general idea. I actually had the good fortune of working in Colombia years ago, and I remember meetings were scheduled either for the morning or the evening. The morning started at about 9 o'clock, so when a meeting was scheduled for the morning, I understood it to be as about 9 o'clock. So I showed up at 9, no one else was there. People started to trickle in around 10 o'clock, but they got their coffee and their snack first. So the morning meeting started usually any time between 10:30 and 11 o'clock, but it wasn't exact really. Now it's worthwhile to note that not only each country, but each company will also have its own culture. What I described to you here in the Colombian case was actually an NGO. If I worked in a big city for, let's say, a multinational corporation, I might have had a very different experience. So as a general rule, I think it is wise to ask whomever you work with or work for what the culture is in terms of time. And if you're very, very unsure and no one gives you a straight answer, I suggest that you be early rather than late. That is always perceived better if you're early rather than arriving late. If you're early, you can always have a plan B, have a book with you, and just kill time until everyone else arrives. The next important aspect of culture that I think is always worthwhile to explore is nonverbal communication. Now, this is a broad category. It includes posture, body language, eye contact, gestures, facial expressions, and a host of other things, anything that is non-verbal. Of course, it's difficult to act always 100% culturally appropriately, especially when you're in a culture that you're not familiar with. But there are a few things that you can watch out for and come across more proficient even if you're not so familiar with the culture. And a couple of these things are gestures and also personal space. In low context cultures, people tend to have a little larger personal space than in high context cultures. And how much exactly, that's hard to tell, but you can maybe ask someone if you have a business meeting in a country or in some kind of a context that you're really not familiar with. For example, I'm European. I had a dear friend in graduate school who was Indian, and so often I felt like he was right in my face, even though I know he didn't mean to be. Likewise, his perception might have been that I was trying to get away from him, even though I didn't mean to. There really aren't any strict rules or rules that are easy to pinpoint as to how much personal space people need in what culture. I just wanted to point this out to you because I think it's something that is good to be aware of and observant of when we are in an environment that we are not so familiar with culturally. Another aspect of nonverbal communication that can get a little tricky is gestures. My general policy is to keep my gestures to a minimum when I'm in a cultural context that I'm not familiar with. Gestures can get quite difficult and understood differently in various cultures. Something as simple as the thumbs down, for example, has various meanings depending on where you're at. In the United States, for example, thumbs down simply means it's something that you don't like, don't recommend, don't enjoy. There is nothing vulgar about it, really. It's a fine gesture to use. In Hungarian culture, on the other hand, it's a vulgar gesture, and I don't recommend using it even in a private context, let alone in a business environment. And the last aspect of communication I'd like to touch upon in this video is the level of directness in different cultures. In a low context culture, most of the communication is going to be explicit, so it's not up to your imagination to decide what is expected. I think where it gets tricky to know what is exactly expected of us in a business environment especially is in a high context culture. Because in high context cultures, it is assumed that you know a lot of things that are not actually explicitly stated. It's always good practice to double check with business partners and colleagues in a written form as to what's expected and what the agreement is. In a high context culture, I think that is particularly important. So to summarize this video, we talked about perception of time, nonverbal communication, and level of directness. If you pay attention to these three main aspects of culture, you should be fine in any business environment. Thank you so much for watching this video. Give it a thumbs up if you liked it. That is interculturally accepted and appreciated. And please let me know in the comments below what culture you identify with the most. I really can't wait to hear from you, and have a wonderful time presenting your bright ideas in a variety of cultural contexts.